In the last video of this series, we learned that Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic seemed to incorrectly include Pascal's wager in his list of arguments for God's existence that he was evaluating. But out of charity, we granted that it may have just been a simple mistake because, after all, we can all make mistakes when we're in a hurry or not thinking carefully enough about something, so we shouldn't just jump to conclusions just yet. So let's just give the benefit of a doubt and see if he does better this time around. Let's see if he'll prove that he does understand the arguments that he's objecting to, because after all, according to him,
I've become pretty familiar with the popular arguments for God's existence, both because my theist viewers send them to me literally every day in comments and emails, all that. Thanks, guys. And because it's important to me to seek truth in studying arguments contrary to my position.
So for someone that sees these arguments every single day and seeks the truth by studying these arguments, we would expect for him to at least know the basics of the arguments. So we can at least count on that much, all right? Why are you looking at me like that? Okay, now stop it. Don't be that skeptical. I mean, use some charity here. I'm talking about the basics. There's no way that he doesn't understand things so basic that it's impossible for him to miss them if he's read literally anything published on the argument. My goodness. I mean, I know you're skeptical, but okay, I'll tell you what. How about we cast some votes, okay? So pause the video and let me know what you think down below real quick. Let's see how many people believe that he'll at least get the fundamental, bare bone, bottom, basic facts right, okay? So now pause, write your vote down below, and then we'll come back here shortly. You ready? And go. Okay, now that you've cast your vote, let's see if you were right. Let's see what Drew has in store for us this time around. Now, I'm ready, but the only real question is, meme team, are you guys ready? Then let's go!
In D tier, we have the ontological argument. There are several forms of this, so I'll address its first, Anselm's ontological argument. It goes like this. God is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. God exists as an idea in the mind. A being that exists both in reality and the mind is greater than one which only exists in the mind. If God only exists as a concept in our mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God, a greatest possible being that does exist. We can't imagine something that is greater than the greatest possible being we can imagine, therefore God exists. Yeah, that one is a pretty wild ride, so in case you're confused, ontological arguments essentially boil down to saying a greatest possible being exists somewhere, a necessary criteria for the highest possible greatness is existence, therefore a greatest possible being, God, exists.
And pause. So now his basically boiled down version wasn't exactly right, but we can go ahead and just let that slide for now. And real quick, I want you to keep in mind what the goal of this video isn't, because I know how the internet gets, okay? So the goal of the video is not to prove the ontological argument is true or anything like that, but instead to examine how reliable of a source Drew is when it comes to understanding the arguments. So now, given his channel size, if he's wrong, he's passing on a lot of misinformation. So if you're a person who genuinely cares about the truth, you'll be happy to know that we have objective standards for seeing how right or wrong Drew is, because we can look to literally any intro philosophy of religion textbook or course on the planet to verify if he's right or wrong when it comes to the most fundamental basics. Now to his objections.
This argument commits the fallacy of begging the question, as its conclusion is already included within one of its premises. Its first premise says that a greatest possible being exists, and eventually concludes that a greatest possible being exists. It claims God exists after simply defining God as existent.
And we can stop right there. So Drew accuses the ontological argument of begging the question. Now, when I first heard this, I was genuinely confused how he could have possibly concluded that the argument was question begging. And then I heard the reasons that he gave and rewound again to hear what he said. And that's when I realized something troubling. I noticed a subtle progression here in how Drew stated the first premise. He stated it 3 times, but changed it each time until he got to a version that was distorted beyond recognition. Now let me show you what he did. The first time he states the premise, he says,
God is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. God exists as an idea in the mind.
Which is a basically accurate version of Anselm's first premise. But the premise is all about the idea of the greatest conceivable being, or God. And as he said, God exists as an idea in the mind. So Drew's statement here is accurate enough. But then he restates it a second time in what he calls the basically boiled down version, as being
a greatest possible being exists somewhere.
So now this isn't exactly true, but if I'm being charitable, I guess I can kind of sort of see it's true if in the mind as an idea counts as somewhere. At the risk of sounding redundant, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, the first premise is about the idea of God, not about God actually existing in reality. Then, right when he gets ready to present his objection to the argument, he restates the first premise one more time as
its first premise says that a greatest possible being exists,
which at this point doesn't even remotely resemble Anslem's first premise, nor does it fit anywhere in the flow of Anslem's argument. Again, the starting point of Anslem's argument is all about the idea of the greatest conceivable being, not that the being exists. And anyone who's read literally anything on this argument before already knows this, since it's the most absolute and most basic idea in the argument. Now, I want you to see why this matters. So Drew gives a false first premise as grounds for arguing that the argument is question-begging because, as he says,
its conclusion is already included within one of its premises.
Aha! Did you catch that? Now, I hope it's clear what he did. He substitutes Anslem's first premise for a made-up version of the premise in order to object to the argument.
Its first premise says that a greatest possible being exists, and eventually concludes that a greatest possible being exists.
The only problem is, of course, the first premise doesn't assume that God exists because it's only talking about the idea or concept of God existing in the mind. It doesn't assert that God exists in reality, so it doesn't assume its conclusion in the premise, and therefore it's not question-begging. Now, this is why this is so significant, because this is impossible to miss if he's ever read so much as a quarter of a single published paper on the argument. And I say just a quarter, since this is the first line of thought that you unpack when you read the argument, which is why it's the very first premise. So unfortunately, it looks like Drew had to shift to a made-up version of the argument in order to object to it.
The ontological argument relies upon its decent refutation resistance stat. It deceptively appears complex, giving the impression that its refutation would also need to be complex. It still does not hide its fallacies well, however, so it ultimately makes poor use of its confusability.
So then Drew goes on to claim that the argument doesn't hide its fallacies well. But keep in mind, if Drew wants to claim that the argument doesn't hide its fallacies well, then it's his burden to show that it actually has at least one fallacy in the first place. Because if it were so easy, we would expect for Drew to easily point one out to us without having to change the premise in order to do so. But again, let's just be charitable here, and let's say that Drew may have just gotten confused and it was an honest mistake, and Drew just didn't do as much research as he probably should have. That's at least possible. But if you believe that it was an honest mistake and that Drew was wrong about something so basic and so fundamental to even the most surface understanding of the argument, we gotta ask, what else is he wrong about when it comes to these arguments? Click the playlist down below to find out. But the next time that you see Drew changing a premise of an argument to a straw man in order to object to it, what are you gonna say? What do you mean?